Morning members, welcome to the Planning Committee meeting, Committee Whakariti Mahiri. Today is the 4th of September, so this meeting, welcome to the members of the committee, councillors, mayor, independent Maori statutory board members, our staff and visitors today. And firstly, I will take apologies. Just before I do that, members, we've just got a slight technical glitch on one of our monitoring screens today, so the one on my right is operating, the one on the left is not, so if you can just crane necks as best you can today. I'll take apologies first for Councillor Clow, leave of absence, Member Tohinere for lateness, Councillor Philip Paina for absence, Councillor Fletcher early departure, and they are noted. Do I have a second, please? Councillor Hills. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Are there any declarations of interest, members, on any item on the agenda? There being none, we'll move past that. I'll move confirmation of the minutes of 7th of August. The motion's on the screen. Do I have a second? Second. Councillor Simpson, thank you. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Takes us to petitions. There are none. Then we arrive at item 5, public input. So I'll just brief you members on requests and acceptances and a decline on public input. 3 requests have been accepted, so 4 in total. The first is from Vector, the publicly listed company, who will speak about the impact of the April 18 storm. Members, you will recall that we had planned to have this in a workshop. It was the planning committee's schedule that came under pressure. Vector were very willing to come to the workshop. Our program going forward is also pressured, so I considered having it in the open business meeting, and I think it's good to have it here because the public also have an interest in the April storm outage. So we welcome Vector here today. We will also welcome the Auckland Marina Users Association Chair Richard Steele with regard to the item on the agenda, and also Ben Ross looking at the urban geography of the Auckland to Hamilton spatial planning on the rail corridor there. And one that came in after time was from David Borson, the development manager of Empire Capital. They have interests in the Bayswater Marina, Pine Harbour Marina, and the West Park or Hobsonville Marina. That was out of time as per Standing Order 7.7.2, but it also put us under pressure of the time limit for public input overall. So I've declined David Borson, and an email has gone to Mr. Borson in that regard. So we will proceed. I'll just check with the staff and welcome the Chief Executive of Vector, Simon McKenzie, and the Networks Officer, Chief Networks Officer, Andre Bota, and the Government Relations Manager for Vector, Nicholas Albrecht. So welcome, Simon. Welcome to your team.
Thank you.
To the meeting of the Planning Committee.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Members, I could formally ask for a resolution which would require 75% to relax the standing orders for this, but I think there will be a general willingness just to allow Vector to make a comprehensive presentation on what was a significant event that had significant impact upon Auckland back in April. In your hands, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acknowledge yourself and His Worship the Mayor and other councillors. Can I just start by saying that Vector does have pride in our relationship with Auckland Council, and as we can visibly see each night on the Auckland Harbour Bridge with the Vector lights. I would also like to acknowledge Councillor Sharon Stewart and Councillor John Watson in terms of a previous meeting we have had here at the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Group Committee meeting, in which resolutions were passed that highlighted this partnership between Auckland Council and Vector, especially around working together on getting information from data from the electricity retailers, and also working together around working with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment in regards to tree regulations. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, Mr. Chair. It's my job now to pass it on to our CEO and Chief Networks Operator to talk about the recent storm, or hurricane, I should say.
Thanks, Nicholas, and thanks very much for having us here today. I'd just like to firstly obviously acknowledge that with regards to the magnitude of the storm, we obviously acknowledge the impact on customers, and that's something we take very seriously with regards to how can we always look to improve the response to customers. I thought I'd firstly just clarify why we call this hurricane no name. The interesting dynamic is that the storm was basically not predicted up until as late as around 6 o'clock in the evening on April the 10th. There was a chance that there'd be strong winds, but nothing of the magnitude that we actually experienced. Interestingly, when we look at what's happening now with climate change and actions taken globally, is we're now seeing that consumers, when they actually think about cyclones coming down from like the tropics, obviously are aware of the issues with regards to there's a build up and people become aware of it, so there's a kind of a readiness element to a storm arriving. And what we find now in countries like North America, where storms that are coming as opposed from the tropics up, coming from the north, or in the case of New Zealand, coming from the south into areas such as Auckland, are basically now being named. So it was an interesting dynamic that we actually looked at post the fact that as this event wasn't basically hardly articulated, there was very little media talk about an event of this magnitude. It also caught many people by surprise, particularly consumers. We certainly had people on standby and crews stood down ready for an event that was experienced later in the evening. And why do we say that it changed everything? It's changed everything in a number of ways. One, it's brought forward the agenda through MB, which is to look at tree regulation. It's basically put that as a higher priority. That's been sitting with MB since about 2015, something that most of the industry across the country have been very concerned about, this issue about tree legislation, and also about sharing of information across the sector and with entities such as the council. If we just look at what essentially happened with regards to the event, we'll go to the first slide. And this is a graph which demonstrates the wind speed as well as the dark bars, essentially what we call the feeders, or the areas of the network that are taken out by the vegetation. So as you can see, in the early part of the evening, even though we had winds that were in excess of 75 kilometres an hour, 75 kilometres an hour typically is where we start experiencing damage from vegetation. So we were doing pretty well. There's very few bars, there's very few outages. And then around about 9 o'clock at night, we saw wind speeds reach 215 kilometres an hour, which by any measure is significant. And as you can see from that graph, we experienced in a very short space of time a significant amount of damage that basically took a lot of the network out. Also on the graph you'll see the blue line, that's restoration of customers, but on the other lines, that kind of beige colour, I guess would be fair to say, that post the storm or post the significant wind event, there was still a significant amount of time where we saw over 75 kilometre an hour winds that were causing further damage, given that there was a significant amount of damage in trees that were compromised. Those winds further basically caused problems across the network, as well as around about the Thursday there was a significant lightning events that we had to deal with. Obviously we can't send people out into conditions which are unsafe to work in, and so it was a good few hours before crews could get out, and Andre will talk further to that. I think I'd just also like to point out that we've had other storm events, but this is the first we've ever seen of the magnitude and just the, for want of a better word, the destructive nature in such a short space of time. In other events you typically see things unravel slowly, so there could be strong winds that last for a few days, and you have faults or outages on the network that occur not at the same time, that might be 4 hours in between. It makes the logistics significantly different. Put this in context, there were over 4,000 areas of damage on the network. The other aspect which I think is also relevant just to talk about is the topography of how a network is architected. So in simple terms, what we call a high voltage line is essentially like a main road which takes the power into the areas such as the suburbs. Down off the side streets would be known as what we call a low voltage network connection, and what would be known as the equivalent of a customer's driveway is the customer's connection line. So those customer connection lines are owned by the customers, they're not owned by us, and we'll come back to the relevance of that shortly. I'll just hand over quickly now to Andre to take you through the kind of logistics and what went on with some of the examples of the storm.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, just to add to what Nick said at the start of the meeting is from an operational perspective, it was great working with Civil Defence and Lifelines. You know, I think it was just a wonderful get together of all the resources, so that was very encouraging, so I wanted to thank everybody for that. This is what we saw the morning of following the storm, and as Simon already highlighted, it's about 4,000 points across the network where we occurred damage. And to Simon's point, what was unique about this is how widespread the damage was, right from the HV, as Simon explained, you know, the major supply routes, through to customers' personal property. We saw damage similar to this caused by trees. Now, we had all our crews on standby from the day before, and we cancelled all planned work, so we could send out all our crews the moment it was safe to do so, and that's a very important thing to know, that as Simon showed on the previous graph, the wind carried on that whole week and the rain carried on, and we had severe lightning storms, and that was our priority, to make sure that these circumstances were safe for crews to work in, and we started tackling this restoration. Doing the restoration effort, we had support from outside of Auckland, but just to put it in perspective, Taranaki, the weekend before, had a tornado that went through. Counties had similar issues because the storm affected them as well. So we really had to go outside the normal place that we would normally go, which is our closest neighbours, to get support, because we knew from the second day onwards that to restore 4,000 points of damage is not going to be a quick job. Thanks, Simon. Oh, it jumped a few. Okay, thanks. Just one more. Yep. Now, just showing you a few slides on what we saw that morning following the storm, and each slide sort of has a story. The importance of this slide was to note how difficult it was to get access to the damage caused by these trees. The trees that came down were really big, and they caused us really difficulty with access to the damaged assets and to the damaged homes. So we had to, our crews first of all had to focus on getting the trees cut and to clear the way for the repair crews to come in, which is quite unique. Normally you can see the damage, and it's normally quite accessible following a storm. I think the other point to note is, you may recall that in the week following the storm we had a report of a near miss where our crews had just repaired some really extensive repairs at Muriwai, And as they were standing there, a tree came down behind them and basically demolished everything they had done and caused a further 24-hour outage to those customers. So this is sort of, what was unique about the storm, the fact that it just kept on giving, and which took us a bit by surprise. So, this is a sort of interesting slide because in addition to showing the fact that the overhead line was taken down, what's not obvious from the photo is in a lot of places the roots pulled the cables from under the ground. So you sort of, after 20 or 30 years, those roots our cables are typically a metre below the ground, would easily grow through it, and the roots just pulled that out. So it was quite extensive. And to Simon's point, if you look at the tree regulations, the small window that it allows a utility to cut around a conductor, I mean, how can you have a vegetation program if the wind is so strong, an effective vegetation program if the wind is so strong that it brings down trees of this size, which is way outside of what we would refer to as the growth limit zone. So it's way outside our regulatory window to cut. Yeah, to Simon's point, under the regs, we're allowed to cut anywhere between half a metre, like if you can imagine a window of half a metre to 1.5 metre around these conductors. And I mean, a good sized branch that's 2 metres or 3 metres tall above the line breaks off and takes it off. The important reason for showing this is that the damage was not just Vector's network. Our customers were severely, their property was severely damaged by sort of their trees and the combination of Auckland Transport and Auckland Council trees. And the thing about this is that the service connection, so that if you want to use the analogy someone referred to, the driveway of electricity to the home is owned by the customer. And in Australia, where I've worked for a very long time, you're not allowed to repair those. You typically repair up to the street, and then the customer has to phone for an electrician. Vector made a decision to basically help customers. So our crews cut away the trees and reconnected the line. If you can go to the next slide, someone, thank you. Skip this one. Thank you. Yep. So thank you. I just was too fast for my own good. So what we had about 1,000 to 1,500 incidents of where the home was so damaged that the line couldn't just be reconnected with a simple reconnection. And we made the decision, as I said earlier, that we will not leave that house without power. So we got into the area. Our crews fixed it. Now a crew of 2 to 3, will take them a few hours to repair that. We had to get in builders to repair of it. Some of the damage was inside the house. So we even had to send our technicians into the home to make repairs to the switchboard and replace fuses. And I think if you use the Australian analogy, that was a much better outcome for Vector's customers. Although the cost to the shareholder is quite big, this would be nearly $2 million that we would have spent just on repairing service lines. Yep.
So we thought there's obviously been questions asked about undergrounding and the context around that, so we thought we'd just cover that from the perspective of how much of our network is undergrounding and what does it mean from a reliability perspective, undergrounding versus other choices. So Vector's network is 55% undergrounded. I'd also note that on an annual basis we're investing significantly in the growth of Auckland. To put that in context, we're building a city roughly the size of Hamilton every 2.5 to 3 years from a network perspective, which is a significant investment into the growth of Auckland. As you see there, we're at 55% underground. Wellington Electricity is slightly higher, largely due to having less rural network. And you'll also see down the bottom right-hand corner how we stack up against cities over in Australia and networks over in Australia, with probably the relevant ones being in Melbourne, Gemina and City Power, which City Power is primarily all urban city at 40% and Gemina being 30%. So both those networks have less rural networks than we do. So we have a significant amount of undergrounding across Auckland, but if we then look at what it would cost to actually underground the rest of the network, so that's taking it from the 55% to the 100% number, we're talking to do the urban network would be 3.6 billion, and to do the rural network would be about 1.9 billion. I think it's important to also note that that does not include all the other services and upgrades that would be required to underground those networks. That's just the electrical cost. It's not the other elements that typically get done in an undergrounding project, such as the undergrounding of the telecommunications network, and also other aspects such as streetlight poles and footpaths and all the other amenities that typically get associated with an undergrounding project. So in a cost perspective, that would be a significant cost increase to consumers across Auckland. That 5.5 billion is more than our current asset value of the electricity network. So that's a significant increase in costs from a cost to consumer. And also from a outcome perspective, undergrounding admittedly has some benefits. It's significantly more costly, but all network we're currently building is underground. I think the other thing is that that would also create a significant economic write-down of assets that were being transitioned from overhead to underground, and economically that would be a very difficult decision to actually make. The other aspect is with undergrounding is that, as we've seen in some instances in other jurisdictions, that undergrounding is also susceptible to other characteristics or outages. So, for example, earthquakes cause significant problems with underground networks, and underground networks are also susceptible to things such as cable strikes, where people are directional drilling or excavating, and those repairs typically take a lot longer to put in place. That's not saying that there's still parts where it makes sense for undergrounding, but it's a picture that has to be understood with regards to it's not a silver bullet, for want of a better word, to insulate against climatic or environmental conditions that can cause resiliency issues. The other aspect which I'd probably just note is that we have just put out of paper, which we've left you with a copy of, which talks about the whole concept about resilience. And I think it's important to note that that obviously explores, as we're seeing now with customer options and new technology, a wide range of technologies, that our objective is say, how can we provide the best solution at the least economic cost to consumers, or the least cost, whilst maintaining the reliability that customers expect. And resiliency is also not only just with regards to the distribution network, but it also goes right back up the supply chain. So from a customer perspective, they can experience an outage that originates either in the generation sector, transmission sector, or distribution sector. So the paper canvasses those types of topics, and it also canvasses what solutions have been looked at in other jurisdictions. And you'll see in there, for example, in some jurisdictions, they've, with regards to tree regulations, they cut 40-metre wide corridors around power lines, which probably wouldn't be acceptable for the good folk of Auckland, but that certainly occurred in some jurisdictions. And some of the other areas that we are seriously investing in and looking at is other technologies that fit for different environments. An example of that is a microgrids that we're building in both Kawakawa Bay and also Tapora up in the north, where they have experienced through, challenging environmental conditions with rain and road washouts and vegetation issues, supply challenges. And so, Andre, just quickly touch on what those microgrid means and how we're seeing more of those evolving.
Yeah, effectively, a microgrid is just a small generator that sits behind the customers or within the community or behind the customer sort of supply point. And it consists of modern day technology like a battery for storage. It's got a combination of either renewable, like solar to charge the battery, or even in some instances you can use a diesel generator. But the key thing is when you lose the supply to that area and to those customers, then this will kick in and provide them some better customer experience during that outage. And to Simon's point, in some of these cases, it's just we see the effects of climate change, like in Kawakawa Bay, where the road just get washed away, and there's just no ways we can go over the hills with lines and through all the trees. So it's really exciting that these are now becoming very reliable, and the price points are improving on a daily basis as these new technologies become more widely used.
I think also the other aspect which the paper does kind of canvass, and it is very much a discussion paper, it's not by any means saying we've got all the solutions. Its intent is to actually start the conversation around resilience, and when we look forward into the future, how do we find the best economic solutions for communities or individual customers. And what we are seeing from a perspective both here and globally is the significant increase in things such as electric vehicles. Something that we have, we've invested in a lot is trialling technology that relates to electric vehicles, and you might ask what the relevance of that is to power outages. The fact is we have technology now that for a small device you can actually plug your electric vehicle into the device and it will actually power your home, or at least a significant number of the appliances in your home. So there's more and more of these types of solutions that would be relevant for different communities or different areas. So for example, if we looked at a remote community, if the customer had either solar and battery like a microgrid, or they had an electric vehicle, or they wanted to put in a diesel generator or a standby generator, then these are actually economically, we believe, cheaper than actually burying network underground. It isn't going to actually benefit consumers, and also potentially burden future generations with costs that are not that relevant. I think it's also fair to say that some of the biggest challenges that we faced was actually communicating with customers. We have an outage app that unfortunately didn't stand up to the expectations that we have of being able to communicate with customers. That was disappointing. It's been a great tool up until the time when it started auto-generating response times, which sent false expectations to customers about when their power would be restored, and that's something that we are rebuilding, and recognise that was not a good customer experience at all, and something that we obviously take really seriously. It also is extremely challenging, as you'll appreciate, when something comes through of this magnitude, to actually be able to identify where all the damage is caused, and then with the crews available actually start estimating how long it's going to take to respond. So with somewhere in the order of 4,000 kind of points of damage, whether it's at an individual customer's home or into a large feeder network area, we prioritise based on where we can restore as many customers as possible. I guess from that customer care perspective, just a couple of other things that we also wanted to just note, that we also, with council, we obviously with their support, we actually made sure that we got packages out to those communities where they had experienced longer term outages. So those included, food, water, and also LPG cylinders that we provided to the communities to recognise that they had been out for some time. So this just seems to have given up the ghost, but I guess that pretty much that's LPG being taken out into communities where they've had outages for a prolonged period of time, and just really to try and support those communities to provide heating and being able to cook on barbecues or the likes. And lastly, that one there. So lastly, a technology that we're also developing, and we're putting in a couple of these down in the Wynyard Quarter, is what we call smart poles. The context around the smart pole is it's turning what would have been a traditional pole into something much more, for want of a better word, relevant and multi-purpose. So these smart poles can not only have electric vehicle chargers in the base of them, has telecommunications hosting on them, has environmental scanning, but also, as you'll see up there, this is just a representation of what it does, is a technology called aerial bundled conductor. So this basically means that we could get it at a higher obviously these have got street lights on them. We can get the conductor at a higher level in the community above the tree line to mitigate as much vegetation damage as possible, and also not have things such as wind conditions where conductors clash. So aerial bundled conductor is certainly something that we're looking at, particularly for going into communities where there is a lot of vegetation, that no matter what kind of cut zone we can get a metre, as you can imagine, with the tree swaying is virtually nothing, but it's certainly another form of technology that we're looking to essentially deploy. So we're more than happy to take questions, and if we've missed anything out, we're happy to canvass those.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Andre. Thank you, Nick. Members, at the outset, there's been some media coverage of Vector recently, but it's been about the governance, be it the current chairman or the 75% shareholder that is in trust. And we have the management, the chief executive and the management here today, so maybe you could direct your questions to management issues that they have some control over. Questions? Mayor.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and I think it's helpful in seeing the enormity of the event and understanding what the consequences were. At the same time, I guess, to have such a high percentage of the city with a loss of power was really serious. So the first question, I guess, is, from the experience of this event, what have we learned from it to know what we might do differently in anticipation or in response to a future event of this nature?
Yes, I think certainly Andre will chip in, but I think there's a number of layers to that. I think first and foremost it was, for us, it's very much around recognising that with climate change these types of events are likely to occur more. We've done climate change modelling, utilised EY, where the frequency of these types of events and the wind strengths are likely to increase. So off the back of that, that's led down the path of producing this resilience paper, looking at what investment options we can make available to communities. So for example, the Kawakawa Bay microgrids, the Tapura microgrids, looking at deploying aerial bundle conductor, and then also alternate technologies such as vehicle to home technology solutions. On top of that, I think one of the biggest issues is also about how we communicate with customers about the event, the magnitude, and keep them informed as to where progress is. And obviously, with regards to our network, also looking at where can we strengthen that by basically putting in elements such as multiple switching points or further switching in the network to auto-correct. We've got a technology we're deploying called the Internet of Energy, which is essentially artificial intelligence that can look at circumstances across the business and switch in other technologies such as batteries or electric vehicles or solar panels, or cease charging from chargers that will actually also help auto-correct. I think the other aspect is us being able to get access to metering data is something that we're certainly working on. So from the retailers, so then we can communicate better to consumers. And I guess the last thing is certainly really pushing for this tree legislation to actually be have a high priority with MB, because it's not only an Auckland issue, it's a nationwide issue, and it's something that's been sitting basically as an issue that needs to be resolved pretty quickly. I think communicating with tree owners is an extremely important point, because the legislation as it largely sits means that the responsibility for clearing trees from lines largely sits with those owners. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think an important lesson learned for us was that, for instance, when we got to Riverhead and started taking calls from customers were saying, but my sewage isn't working or the tank is filling up, and we were not aware that what's now a urban suburb effectively has got a different standard of water management and sewage management than your more established areas. So I think that was an important lesson for us to learn, and also that's part of the purpose of the resilience paper, to inform customers that they've got options to improve the resilience of their own systems behind the meter. I think the other point that's very important for us that was sort of a valuable lesson learned is the access issue to get to the site. We had to use a helicopter the following day to get up in the air just because the trees were blocking the road, whether you're in the city or in the rural areas, to assess the damage. But also towards the end of the restoration, we had customers where they own poles because it's private and assets with a dedicated line on there. We had to fly a helicopter to drop off those 2 poles because access was just impossible. So access, and then I think at a very low operational level, communications was a big frustration. And wherever I've gone back to customers afterwards, to communities, it was, whether it's the radios that didn't work, or even the landlines didn't work because the local exchange had batteries that ran out. So that is one of the things we've shared with Civil Defence, and which they're well aware of as well. And like, for instance, to someone just reminded me, we flew generators out to the telco sites, some of the telco companies to their sites to get the cell towers going to enable us to communicate. But there's like cry outs from the community for even a radio station they can go to get information. So customers were really crying out for information and getting updates from the collective Civil Defence group, which includes us.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Members, I've got quite a batting list here. If we could maybe keep our questions to 2 or 3 questions, and then if we've got time, we'll come back to you if you've got more questions. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you, Mr Mackenzie, to you and your team for your presentation and for being open and transparent in a public way. Look, you're presenting to Council today, so my question is really about our assets. I mean, Auckland loves our trees. You hear it time and time again, they're the lungs of a city, and intensification, we need more. We've got the Mayor planting 1 million trees. We've got many communities planting trees on council land. So what proportion or how much impact did the trees on council land have in the storm versus trees on private land? You know, was it pretty even, or was it a lot of the damage done as a result of trees on council land? Do you have any data around that?
Andrew's got a bit of view.
Yeah, I just sort of want to clarify that when we respond to a storm of this, obviously our priorities are on the safety of the public and the safety of our staff, and then to get the power on in a safe manner as quickly as possible. So unfortunately, we don't have systems in place where we do a count of what's caused this, especially if the damage was this widespread. But gut feel, and based on what I saw when I went out to the network and the feedback from my own staff and from council's arborists, which worked with us, is that the majority of the damage was by trees, of course. And I think I would sort of say there's maybe a 60-40% split between private, just thinking of the repair effort afterwards, between private owned and council / Auckland Transport, which we in the majority, I would guess about 60%, but there's no science behind that.
60% for council or 60% for private?
60 for council / Auckland Transport.
Interesting, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, just got a question around applying your customer choice matrix, particularly as it goes to undergrounding and the like geographically. I'm making the assumption that there are particular areas, say Piha and the like, where you've got a lot of trees overhanging the road. Have you applied a geographic approach around undergrounding, so that in an instance where dealing to those trees could be really problematic for a whole variety of reasons, what about undergrounding or some of the other techniques that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I guess probably an answer to that in a couple of ways. The first way is all new network is largely under the district plan is built underground.
I know.
Secondly, with regards to just removing overhead structure, and replacing with underground. The primary issue with that is geographically is on this side of the harbour bridge, and that is by virtue of the legacy ownership decisions made when basically Vector was formed, and also at the time of listing where a deed was put in place where we were to carry on a certain amount of undergrounding for the community on this side of the bridge. And then with regards to where we underground, where it makes economic sense for other attributes, when we are looking at, so for example, you mentioned Piha, those types of areas, we'd look at more the aerial bundle conductor or some short sections which might be in challenging areas to underground. So do you want to add anything to that?
I just think it's important to note that undergrounding tree-laden streets is in fact very, very difficult because of the damage you potentially could cause to the roots of the trees. So if we go down a street and we want to underground, there's a lot of technical and arborist sort of issues that arises because of the fact that of the potential damage to roots. So that's part of it, and that's why the smart pole that Simon showed is such a good idea, because you're only disrupting a small bit of earth and you're lifting the conductor above most tree lines, and then it's a fully insulated conductor.
So just further to that, have you looked at that approach in Waitakaris and the like?
It is.
Bundle conductor.
Yes. We are doing pilots. We are going to be doing pilots as part of our response to the storm in areas where the vegetation is really protected and we can't go with bare conductors. So we're going to do pilots in Piha, Kimu, and Mount Albert.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cooper, please.
It wasn't a question. I just wanted to thank Nick and the team for being so responsive. Like, you know, Sunday mornings early, all of those things, doing your job, I know, but it was very helpful as councillors to be able to just go to the source and you to be able to tell us what was happening and how it was happening and us to give feedback around communication. So I really appreciate that.
Here, that was good, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Hulse.
Thank you, and mine's along the same lines. Councillor Wayne Walker asked my question about the pilot projects in our remote areas. Fantastic. We've got very keen communities out west wanting to do that. I've just got a couple of questions, and mainly it's a wee two from here. Very excited about the resilience work and the opportunities for small, self-contained power generation and power storage. I think that certainly is the way forward, and I hope, and between planning and environment and community, I think this is a really key topic that we need to deal with. And talking to Alice and Andrew, I'm really respectful of the approach that Vector has taken to this. So my first question is maybe to you, Mr. Chair. I think, should we follow this through as a specific issue? I think it is our most important one in relation to climate change. Secondly, the intersect with our tree legislation. I think we have a bit of a I was going to use a very rude word, but a cluster drama, because we've got the...
I love well translated, Councillor.
We've got the intersect between our urban ngāhere strategy, our tree protection rules, and our growing concern by Aucklanders about the fact that they might love trees, but they love their coffee more. And are you feeling fully engaged in the discussions that we're having with regard to tree legislation and tree rules?
Yes, look, I think firstly with regards to the tree legislation, certainly that's conversations we've had with the council staff and management, and I think it's really important when MB actually starts consulting on this that we do have, for want of a better word, a cohesive plan from Auckland. You know, there's no doubt when you look at the legislation, it's kind of been drafted in a one-size-fits-all, and that's not the reality of New Zealand, because a half-metre cut zone in, you know, the bottom of the South Island with tree growth rates is quite a different context to tree growth rates in Auckland, for example. You know, in some cases we know some species grow well over a metre a year, and so you're just forever chasing your tail on trying to cut. So I think from that perspective, we've certainly had good engagement with the council, and we'd really appreciate the continued engagement on the resilience topic and also the vegetation topic.
I think these are critical, Mr Chair. And just to wrap up, I just want to echo Councillor Cooper's acknowledgement of Vector. There was a huge amount of heat and light and drama, and a lot of complaints, and a lot of people were severely impacted by this storm, and we acknowledge that. However, driving out to Piha on the night of the storm to help deliver some stuff on behalf of Civil Defence, I saw your people up poles in conditions that I didn't even feel safe driving in. And these people were up the poles on the cliff at Piha, endeavouring to fix the lines. And for that, I think we owe some of these brave lines people a debt of gratitude. And we need to hold those people in our heads when we're, you know, getting carried away with the drama of it all. So I just want to acknowledge that personally to your Lions people. And secondly, just to say, I think we need some more education about where Vector starts and stops and where people's private lines start and stop, because Councillor Cooper and I were door knocking the next day in the severely affected areas of the West, and there was huge confusion about where the Vector input was and where people's private lines were, and the biggest problem was the trees on private property impacting on private lines. And I think we need a large degree of information sharing about that once we're out of the drama and into the sort of the learning time. So follow up around that, I think, is needed. But can I just say, all things considered, I have a huge amount of respect for the way that this was dealt with and the lessons learned. Thank you.
Thanks very much, really appreciate that, and we certainly also acknowledge the guys in the field. I mean, we have to work obviously with fatigue and also safety, and one thing that we are very proud of, that we got through this whole period of time without any health and safety issues. I think the other aspect that you raise is with regards to the further clarification of where, you know, the ownership of lines changes and whose responsibilities. We're actually just relaunching the first stage of the, you know, for want of a better word, the website where people can go to, or the app where people can go to understand where there is outages. And on that, we're doing a series of, I guess, just short little videos which actually go into that explanation, which talks about, you know, where essentially the customer's network begins and what their responsibilities are. Talks about tree vegetation management. So that'll be out. I think we're going to be putting that up this week.
Okay. I think, Mr Chair, it would be useful for us to piggyback with some of our council information sharing on that work. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Councillor Casey.
Well, my question was about forecasting and whether you're 100% comfortable that we've got the forecasting right in terms of the increased number of wind events that we're projecting out into the future, and also whether that forecasting is being, this is more a question for us, is actually getting to the people that need to possibly find another alternative cooking source and put some gas in the cupboard and so on. So two parts to the question, one for you and maybe one for us.
Sure. Look, I mean, I guess, and please, I'm not being flippant, I think the problem with forecasting is you're probably always going to be wrong, but certainly the trends from the climate modelling, sure, is that all the evidence suggests there's going to be more events and stronger events. So we will work on that basis and then look at what do we need to do to provide alternate solutions and then communicate those with customers, but also I guess share that information where we can through papers such as this resilience paper. I think there's no doubt that, as I understand it, there'll be more events that come from a northeasterly direction. So, you know, it's not only it's not only the number of events, but it's also direction. There's also has quite different impacts on our network. So if it's from a northeasterly, which is typically from a subtropical kind of system, then that's quite a different impact on our network. So that will primarily hit areas such as Whangaparoa, Waiheke and some of the eastern suburbs, whereas you have more from a southwesterly perspective, then that's obviously where you get more impact out west. So I think also what we have been engaging with is Weatherwatch, who've been really supportive in working with us on modelling, particularly around how do we actually then provide where is the damage most likely to occur in Auckland given certain systems, and I think also this topic which is really important from our perspective is how do we get customers, whether it's from a southerly direction and as occurred with this one, or a northerly direction, how do we build that awareness of the fact that an event may be coming in and therefore what precautions they need to be taking. I guess lastly, with respect to forecasting, what we're also doing is not only recognising that there are more wind events, but there's also more rain events, and there's also the potential for sea level rise. And so for designing our network, we're taking those elements into account, and already in a number of areas we have actually elevated where we would have otherwise put substations in lower lying areas to actually compensate for the potential for flooding and also sea level rise.
So, Mr. Chairman, the second part to that question was some people were taken by surprise with the severity of the winds in April. What are we doing to ensure that if there's forecasting that says the direction and strength of a wind, that we get to the right people and that we give that message out?
Look, we don't have the answer to that now, but we do know that my recollection is the wind shifted into the northwest and it was predicted to be more in the westerly quarter. And so, look, I think that's a discussion that we'll just have to ask our staff to have with Civil Defence and Met Service and forecaster. We don't have the answer to that right now. Thank you. Are there any further questions? Thank you. Just a question of mine. Andre, in some ways, in your presentation, you were at pains to discount the value of undergrounding. You highlighted that the network was prone to disruption, outages, even in undergrounded areas. Do you have a split? Has Vector looked at the number of incidents, pole line, tree ripping line out, in undergrounded areas versus overground infrastructure areas? What's the split?
Just the split between, sorry, I didn't...
The split in incidents, so there were thousands of incidents leading to multiple outages. So you had incidents where there was overground incidents and there were underground incidents. How many were in each category?
I honestly don't have that with me. We'll have to get back to you. I don't even know if I can get that data because, as I mentioned earlier, the focus wasn't on doing the event capturing specific causes. I mean, we can give a more general view. For instance, in the resilience paper, we referred to, you know, obviously, if you've got a storm, an underground network helps a lot with that if the trees don't lift up the cables, for instance. However, in a flood or during an earthquake or a number of the other natural hazards that we face, it is far less effective. And in fact, we can restore an overhead network after a flood, for instance, or you know, if there's a sea level rise, much quicker than we can an underground network. So it's a really fine balance. And as Simon said, all the future work, we're spending about 21% of our budget is spent on undergrounding as we stand currently and projected for the next 10 years. So that's a significant amount. You know, that is 21% of nearly 300 million that we spend on undergrounding. But it is where you have to write down the existing assets to do undergrounding, with the main benefit to consumers being the experience during a storm, for instance, during some storms, and in amenity value, where we can't justify the cost, and the Commerce Commission has not been open to do that as well either. So it's a fine balance for us. But where there's high priority areas like car versus pole, we always look at across the network whether we should underground that piece of road. But you can also, for instance, just by moving the poles away, if the geography allows it, by moving the poles away from the road, address a lot of those. So it's a very topical issue for us all the time whenever we come up with a solution to either improve the customer experience or improve the network reliability. It's part of our toolbox, if I can call it that.
Okay, So I've checked in with the other network providers, not electrical, but the telcos, the big ones, Vodafone, Spark and 2 Degrees, and they've told council that their outages were not as numerous as yours. They've got overground infrastructure, as you well know, using, in most cases, the same poles, and they've got underground infrastructure. But Vodafone on the second day had 10% of their network out and 60 sites. On the third day, there were 45 sites and 8%. Spark had 6% out. And on day 5, Vodafone was at 14 sites, 2 Degrees. We didn't have reports earlier. They had 5 sites. There was no information on the first day. So this is another infrastructure provider that had outages, but not of the magnitude of Vector's. And they have actually also told us that their outages were entirely related to the electrical outage. So their outage was related to yours. Have you talked to the other infrastructure providers, that is the telcos, and compared stories on the incident and looked at how the other infrastructure providers fared and dealt with their incidents, and you did, and looked at how you can work together in the future?
Yeah, I can talk to that. We certainly have. We're talking with those providers with regards to what solutions can we provide to also assist where there is, for example, a cell tower out. I think it's important to put a different context in here, is that having a cell tower out is quite a significantly different outcome to having customer service lines out in a street, because a cell tower obviously serves a geographic patch. If you get that cell tower back up and running, as Andre mentioned, we flew out generators. They have their own standby generators. So that's quite a different network topography to actually having individual lines to each house. So certainly we are discussing how can we actually also, through resilience, provide them alternate solutions. So in recognition that customers need to still be able to communicate, how do we actually deliver those experiences? But certainly in a lot of the areas where we have overhead network, if there has been fibre put on those, fibre would have been out as well.
Okay, it draws me to my third question, and it's around resilience, and power poles are quite resilient, and they cause quite a lot of damage, as you've experienced, to your network. They're being there and the wires hung off them. But Andre, you said quite recently that in the 6 months to June, Vector has reported that the company's power poles in 17 were being struck at the rate of more than 1 a day. And this is pointing to a full year figure of something exceeding 400. The previous highest figure was in 2017 at 359. I've asked Auckland Transport for police records on the number of strikes on very resilient power poles in the last 5 years, and it's caused 182 reported fatal and serious crashes, 14 deaths, 192 serious injuries, and with a social cost of $210 million. Do you factor that into your consideration of your undergrounding program, that there are deaths and serious injuries of at a very high rate with a high social cost? Do you factor that into arriving at the business case for undergrounding?
Well, one of the key stats that we gather and analyse is whether the same pole gets hit by cars after we've repaired it, because that would indicate that part of the road is potentially a problem. And the interesting thing is that we don't have a high correlation with these events. So they're rather random and scattered across Auckland. So once again, when you get to solving that problem, absolutely undergrounding is one of the tools we consider to solve the problem. But you know, the challenge with undergrounding is you're still left with street lamps, which is effectively a pole, and at the same distance apart than our power poles. You're still left with transformers on the ground, which is sometimes in the berm or not too far away from the road. And you know, so you sort of get to the point where you say, well, if you're replacing the power poles with streetlight poles, you know, from that perspective that you're calling out, I'm not too sure what you've gained from that. But it's certainly, yeah, if you look at the smart pole, one of the benefits is because the pole is taller than the standard power pole, it would allow us to get further distance between poles, so less poles, if the topography of the area allows it. And look, I have to apologize if I came across as anti-undergrounding. I'm spending a lot of money on undergrounding, and I'm very proud of the undergrounding projects we do through Entrust. It's taken a dip in recent times because Chorus wasn't prepared to fund their portion of it, which is undergrounding the copper lines, and you can sort of understand why from an investment perspective. They're rolling out fibre, so why would they put copper cables under the ground and then replace them at some point with fibre? But the good thing is now that Chorus have completed their fibre rollout, they've come to the party again, and we are certainly looking at in the trust area to get back to that space where we spend a whole $10.5, $12 million per annum on undergrounding. However, what this has allowed us the past 3-4 years was to use the money the trust set aside. Roughly 60% went into undergrounding, and the rest went into developing solutions that, to Simon's point, not only empowers a customer to be more resilient, but also helps the network to be more resilient. So yeah, if I came across Antti, it's a key part of my, and I guess an interesting stat is after, there were 2 issues after Hurricane Sandy in the States, which as we know killed up to 80 people, unfortunately. First was the undergrounding areas took much longer to repair than the overhead areas, which is because of the flooding that was caused. But secondly, customers' willingness to pay. The moment you started talking about a doubling of line charges, dropped down to less than 10%. And I doubt that if we do a survey in Auckland, we'll find another outcome. You know, spending $6 billion on undergrounding means our line charges goes from circa $700 per annum to the average customer to $1,400 to $2,100, depending if you include the rural area in that. There's so many customers on my network that cannot afford that increase, that it's a real predicament for us to deal with.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you. I guess, Chair, with your indulgence, more of a comment than a question, but I think there is a certain degree of price elasticity in the demand, you know, and that would definitely play out. People want to declutter the road corridor, but they don't want to pay for it. That's a big challenge. The other challenge is obviously there is some legacy issue here that you need to be able to make good for the customers in Auckland and Manukau and parts of Papakura where the shares have been held. The other thing is that clearly you are affected by the trees that are in the road reserve. These trees that are in the road reserve, which obviously impact on your lines, they also impact on the footpaths that crack and lift. And I get a lot of constituents writing to me about that. You are affected by the challenge that you face around weather. Well, actually, so too was water care. When we had the Tasman tempest, we got very turbid water in the Hunua dams. It affects utilities everywhere. I guess what I'm interested in knowing about as we move forward is the willingness of Chorus as the key telco that you have to deal with, their willingness to partner as part of any undergrounding project, because I can see that when you do an undergrounding project, there have to be multiple partners that coordinate their contribution towards achieving a good undergrounding outcome. And I would expect that that would be an ongoing piece of work and stewardship for you, and I'm interested to see how that goes. Chair, just finally, having worked with Vector previously on the undergrounding projects that took place in Weymouth and in Homai, great projects, but there is a significant lead-in time to ensure that you are decommissioning infrastructure that's at the end of its asset life, and that you are able to get the necessary consents in a timely way to coordinate all of that. So more power to your elbow. I support you, but I don't believe that you should necessarily be hung out there as the only utility that faces these challenges, because you don't. You know, potholes form in the road corridor, footpaths crack, unsafe cycleways, trains break down, etc., etc. This is just a problem of Auckland growing and trying to maintain the existing infrastructure, as well as making the step change to a future whereby we will have incremental changes where we move from overground to underground. So I hope you can do some more work in my ward. But I definitely think that you are affected by circumstances to a large extent beyond your control.
Would it be possible to just comment on two things? And thank you very much for the support. Absolutely, an undergrounding project involves Vector, it involves Chorus, and it involves Auckland Transport and the Council and Watercare. So to your point, it is quite a collaborative effort to get it right and to get the timing right. However, there's another thing with undergrounding Auckland that has become a big challenge for us, is just the amount of activity around the city. And if you can imagine, if Vector were to add a global undergrounding project, let's say you could practically do it over the next 5 years, spend the $7 billion. I just don't know where we will get the resources. We're already competing. There's so much infrastructure projects that are now going horizontal. The buildings are coming to an end, more or less, and it's now going to rail projects and roading projects and bus lanes, and it's just incredible. We had a CEO, infrastructure CEO meeting last week, and we're already competing with resources, and there's a global shortage of the skill sets that we need in the civil space, not in the electrical space, in the civil, because the majority cost of an undergrounding project, it's actually nothing to do with electrical, but it's the civil bit and that last mile to the customer's home. So those are two complicating matters, the collaboration needed and the fact that this puts burden on an Auckland infrastructure that's already constrained from a resource perspective.
Thank you.
Yes, and sorry, someone just an important thing. Chorus has definitely come to the party since the beginning of the year now that they've completed their fibre board, and now they want to underground and want to collaborate with us on this. So it's
because they haven't previously, have they?
Yeah, there was a period of time where as I said earlier, it doesn't make sense for them to put the copper underground, and most of the overhead infrastructure that we were looking at, of course, was still copper. So they were waiting for the fibre, but what they're doing now in collaborating with us with undergrounding is they're replacing the overhead copper with underground fibre, which makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. And there are instances where you have abandoned the poles, but Chorus have inherited them, so they are the sole user of the overground, the poles and infrastructure. So it's a complex area. I'll move the A and the B. Members, the B, actually... What's the B?
What's the B?
What is the B? Sorry.
Sorry, you can't see the B. I'll read the B. The B recommends to Vector to embrace the Vision Zero safe system approach. You'll be aware of that from the information that's been coming in on road safety from Auckland Transport. It's embodied within ATAP. It's consistent with our whole strategic approach. To seek to underground services at high-risk locations. We're not asking for the $5.5 billion capital program. Members...
Excuse me, Mr Chair.
No.
We haven't asked Vector what they think of the B. I haven't had their feedback.
Seen it.
No.
No way.
And who defines high risk?
Yeah. Who's
Auckland Transport will absolutely have defined high risk to Vector in the past, and Vector themselves in a press release are concerned about the increasing number of crashes involving live power equipment as a significant safety concern. Members, I just want to stress that 14 people have died, 192 serious injuries, and $210 million in social cost in the last 5 years. And we'll hear from from Auckland Transport very soon on road safety. We could hold this over, we could hold the B over to the road safety item if you like.
Well, I just don't think they've had a chance to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Simon, do you want to, or
Well, I mean, I'm not questioning your numbers. We haven't actually been privy to those numbers before. We're more than happy to engage with Auckland Transport to understand their views on areas. Certainly, with regards to some of these areas, it may not be just a reality. We've also had circumstances where consumers have not wanted poles moved because they're in areas where otherwise the cars would have gone into the houses. So it is certainly a topic we're more than happy to engage with Auckland Transport on. We haven't gone through the Vision Zero safe system approach or anything, but we'd like the opportunity to engage with Auckland Transport on it.
Okay, look, I'll take the B out, members.
Yeah,
I think
thank
we
you.
might consider it under the item with Auckland Transport. I'll move that. Do I have a second, please?
Yes, I'll second.
Deputy Mayor, thank you. Simon, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
And
The Deputy Mayor.
Andre, Nicholas, appreciate your contributions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contra aye.
Thank you,
Contrary
Victor.
no. Declare that carried.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
members. Did you come back with something?
No, you pulled B, so that's good.
Thanks for members allowing the extra time required for that item. Okay, after. Can I ask Richard Steele to come up for the Auckland Marinas Users Association presentation? And after that, members, we've got a presentation from Ben Ross, and then we'll proceed straight to the road safety item with Auckland Transport. Welcome, Richard. You're free to make your presentation.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman, Mayor Phil Goff, councillors, members of the Independent Maori Statutory Board. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity to talk to you this morning. As the Chairman's mentioned, I'm Chair of the Auckland Marina Users Association. I have a background in civil engineering of about 45 years, and I've been involved in a number of strategic studies over that career path. On my right is David Cook from Bayswater, who's available to answer any questions you may have specific to Bayswater Marina at the end of the presentation. I would have been joined by Ewan Little and Bob from Westhaven, Bob McNaughton from Gulf Harbour, June Kearney from Hobsonville, and Rob Alsop Smith, who's chair at Gulf Harbour, but all unfortunately are committed to prior commitments, and there's obviously been very little time to consider the report that's before you today until it arrived yesterday. So that's one of the points I want to make from the outset, that in our belief, to ensure a good outcome from all parties for a strategic approach to marinas in Auckland, it's vital that the scope and approach is first agreed. And our suggestion would be that the first step is to consult and agree a scoping report before further consideration is given to the execution of the study. In its current form, in the report before you today, AMUA would not support the scope as it stands, nor the timeline, which we believe is shaping the scope of the strategic approach. My experience to actually drive a strategic study from time frame does not allow you to reach robust conclusions. There's certainly no explanation for that timeline, and quite frankly, it's a perception amongst our user associations that this is a token strategy to endorse Panuku's original strategy to sell land at the marinas. I'd now like to turn to the presentation slides, and hopefully all of you have got those in front of you. And I will be as quick as possible. I understand there are obviously time constraints. If I start firstly in the top left-hand corner, we do see production of a strategic plan for marinas in Auckland as a great opportunity. There are 12 marinas in the Auckland region. There are 135,000 boaties. If you only look at 6 marinas, it's a fraction. It's only 50% of the total provision for marinas around the Auckland region. So you're only looking at half the berths. There are a number of all-tide and all-weather ramps which might be applicable to look at as well because they provide safe haven, but that's for the council to consider. But there are also 43,000 trailer boats looking for a place to park. And where better than in the region's marinas, where they are in close proximity to safe haven. And this demand is growing, and it's growing quickly. Boat use in New Zealand doubled in the last 20 years. Where has all that information come from? Council's own resources. This is a Panuku report published in April this year. Process, comments there. We believe it would be appropriate to make it clear to the boating community in Auckland that Council will stop sales until a strategy is in place and has been adopted. We believe far greater transparency than has been the case until now needs to occur. There's been a significant erosion of trust in the boating community and particularly marina users because of the approach adopted so far. And we strongly believe that a steering committee which includes key stakeholders would be an appropriate way to take this forward, both in the formation of the scope of such a strategic plan, but also its execution. We also believe that serious consideration should be given to independence of this strategic planning exercise, as we believe both Panuku and Council are conflicted in their current positions. Consultation is mentioned in the report, and we would strongly endorse at least option 2, which is the targeted stakeholder engagement, but it's not mutually exclusive. We would endorse that the public is also involved. One of the key weaknesses in what has occurred so far is that there has been engagement, most certainly, but there's been scant consideration given to the feedback that has been received, and it's certainly not reflected in the plans that come forward. So consult and address the feedback that they do get from stakeholders. And just to return to the point I made earlier on, more appropriate for a strategic planning exercise to first agree the scope and then timeline. At this point in time, timeline is driving the scope of this study. It seems entirely inappropriate. I've tried to identify some critical issues. I notice in the covering report that it identifies criteria will be identified and then used to assess the strategic plan. Criteria drive any assessment in any project assessment. If you don't ask the right questions, you don't get the right answers. It's a simple way to address that. So I've tried to identify what are the economic, social and environmental goals. What are those criteria? Intensification of housing is often quoted as a reason to intensify development in our marinas. And so is the need for intensification of the way we use our recreational resources. The marinas are a precious resource which we cannot renew, so why are we looking to sell them? Not included in the presentation slide here, or it is, sea level rise is an important consideration. It's just not on your hard copy, so I apologise for that. This is an issue that faces all of our marinas. And I'll just quote one example. At Pine Harbour, the marina bund there is barely 6 inches above current storm sea level rise. That will be eroded in the next 20 years. Sea level rise is a subject which will influence all marinas in the Auckland region. How is our access to water and how is that infrastructure going to be developed in the future to accommodate that challenge? Needs to be considered. And all marinas are a unique community asset. They were actually paid for by the people who bought their leases in the first place. That's what paid for the development. And they are a revenue stream for council. They're not a negative drain. They're not like other recreational assets. So they are unique, and they are a unique opportunity to focus on placemaking. What a great opportunity to focus recreational boating use on our marinas. This strategy seems to be very much still focused on Panuku's original plan to sell land. And scarcity. This is actually commented on in Panuku's own report. There are limited opportunities. There's already waiting lists for marina berths. And as I mentioned earlier on, people are looking for places to park their boats and access them easily and safely. I now turn to the second slide. And I'll keep this as quick as I can, Mr. Chairman. Those of you that have taken an interest in the this marina issue to date, either through the media or through the site visit to marinas yesterday and the earlier briefing we've received, will no doubt be aware that the subjects of things like empowering acts, ownership and trusts, licenses, leases, is complex, and it is. But if this marina strategy for Auckland does not address this issue in all of the marinas around Auckland, it's an issue that will either end up in courts or in the media. It's that serious. And on the right-hand side there, coastal occupation permits, the Auckland Unitary Plan, the Marina Coastal Zone objectives and policies, precinct plans, consents, these are all within council control. How can you rule out 50% of the marinas in Auckland and call it a strategic plan when council has control of all of these functions? And I'd just like finally to draw your attention to what's a good model. It's often useful to look at experience elsewhere and realise what opportunities exist. And in the research that we've done, we identified that Nelson had completed a marina strategy. It's a good document. I've emailed to all of the councillors around this room a link to that study. So you may wish to look at that. It actually combines marina strategy with placemaking strategy. It's quite a visionary document, and it really does capture a lot of the issues that we believe are relevant to Auckland. It was also conducted by an external supplier. It had extensive public and targeted consultation, which is the combination of option 3 that's before you today in the covering report. But interestingly, in Nelson, they concluded that there was a better economic outcome to be achieved for council and the region if the marina remained in council ownership. That's why we've highlighted the need for commercial assessment as part of the strategic plan. Those cover the key points that I wanted to address. But I did just want to finally say that from a Marina Users Association perspective, we think it's premature for this council committee to consider a report that it's barely had for 24 hours.
Yes.
We've had less than 24 hours to respond to it, and I hope we have managed to address some of the issues as we see them. But we believe it's premature to consider that today.
Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to, one final comment, sorry, Mr. Chairman. We would like to see this committee consider recommending to the full council body that they stop any sales of marina land until a strategy has been prepared and has been adopted. And we would like this committee to provide guidance that all marinas should be included in this strategy, with consideration also for standalone dry stacks, and some of the major ramps are in the Auckland region. This is about recreational boating in Auckland, 135,000 constituents. And a decision to, as I say, to defer the recommendations that are before you today, and to take on board, hopefully, the comments that I've made about setting out a strategy process that will address stakeholder concerns regarding independence from Panuku and council conflicts of interest.
Thank you. Questions, members? Councillor Sayers, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think there might be a number of us that might have a bit of concern about the length of time we've had to digest that, so thank you for reinforcing that. But my question through you, Mr. Chair, is I think you mentioned a figure of 12 marinas across Auckland. Are you able to just clarify for me, of those, how many of those are council controlled? And does that include, when you answer that question, does that include the berths or the vacant land for parking or buildings or a combination of those? Is there a mix there?
I don't have a comprehensive answer for you, unfortunately. I did notice that in the covering report it said that there'd been some consideration that the 6 selected were selected on the basis of land ownership. It doesn't include Pine Harbour. Pine Harbour I have specific knowledge of. Pine Harbour there is still an extensive council-owned land, and berth holders there pay lease charges for the car parking space, which is informal recreational space. So the information that's already in this covering report isn't correct in its entirety, most certainly. And sorry, I've missed the second part of your question.
I think that's sufficient. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. Councillor Wayne Walker, please.
Sure. Just in respect of deferring this item and effectively what you refer to as collaboration, is your group available to discuss the scope with council or whatever steering group we might set up?
We would welcome that opportunity. As an association, or as associations, because we're really an umbrella organisation, all of our member associations have a long history of understanding what has occurred at all of the marinas. They understand the legal background and the ownership and the way in which marinas operate. So I believe they could contribute significantly to any steering committee discussion, and we welcome that opportunity, and there is relevant technical expertise within our ranks.
Okay, and the other question I've got goes to your suggestion around independence, and I certainly understand the issues around the conflict regarding Panuku and the like. And this goes to your own experience. Would you suggest that there are companies, consultancies out there that are able to produce something with some independence?
I would believe so, and I referenced earlier on the Nelson strategy document that was prepared by a company called SLR. They're an international business. Their main base is in the UK, but they do have a presence here in New Zealand. They turn over something like $200 million a year, so they're not an insubstantial organisation. And there will certainly be other organisations in the Auckland region that certainly could contribute to this. They've contributed in the past to surveys of recreational boating facilities around Auckland, for example.
Thank you. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Richard, for a very impressive presentation. And I certainly acknowledge your background in strategic studies. My question goes to what is before us today, and we, like you, have just received this, so it's not as if we've had time on this. We've received it at the same time as your association. What do you think the consequences are, perhaps, for this trust, this wider group, the robustness of a strategy, if we are to proceed with the scope that's outlined in our agenda item, as I compare it to what you've put up for us in your second handout there of governance, model, timeline, horizon, etc., etc. What's the relative comparative points between a good outcome, a robust outcome, an outcome that ensures confidence, and the limited scope that we appear to be undertaking here as council?
I tend to take a fairly simple view of life. The approach and scope that's outlined before you today in the covering report, as I've said, we believe is inappropriate. It is not robust in providing Auckland with a marina recreational boating strategy that befits the City of Sails. I referred to my simple approach. If you can't do a job properly, then don't do it. And the fallback situation is there, stop the sales as well. So I just reiterate what I said earlier on. We see this as a great opportunity. There's a big gap here in Auckland to actually have a marina strategy and an approach to how do we make placemaking around our marinas is a huge opportunity, but it needs to preserve the function of marinas as safe boat havens in the first place and cater to our recreational boating needs and blend it also as a wider recreational asset for the community. That informally happens. Why not take it on board as a comprehensive plan?
Thank you. Councillor Newman, please.
Yes, I'm quite interested. You've sent the Nelson Marina strategy, which I've had a chance to read through. That strategy, in terms of the development and the engagement with the stakeholders, I mean, we're talking about actually one marina down there, and the time frame that it took Nelson to do that job properly is quite extensive. We're talking about multiple marinas here. Are you aware that in relation to the development of that strategy that there was quite a divergence, at least initially, that it appears that, and it was all codified in this report, that politically there was probably a desire from the elected membership within the council to optimise the marina. Obviously they've got an economic imperative to raise revenue there, versus the stakeholder aspirations, which were primarily around recreational purposes, as well as the availability of industrial and commercial land and community support facilities. So really the stakeholder engagement, probably if it was done in the Auckland context, is going to come up with something similar but on a much expanded scale. And this would probably lead to requirement for full master planning of the marinas individually, as well as an overall sort of approach as to how they contribute to marine activities. Would that be a fair assumption?
It is a fair assumption. I think the approach that the reason I drew attention to the Nelson strategy, because I felt that the scope of that approach was appropriate for Auckland, and it's an approach that you could use as a baseline and expand upon to cover all of the other marinas in the Auckland region. And yes, you're right. I mean, the timeline in Nelson was quite considerable. I think it ran over 18 months because they had an initial report and then an update report, and I've sent through both copies of those. But I think it is reflective of the importance of that asset in the Nelson context, but also reflects the interest and passion that boaties have for their recreational boating activity here in Auckland.
And just one final question. I'm not sure if in relation to Nelson, if there is an empowering legislation, unlike here in Auckland, we've got the overlay of multiple empowering acts of parliament which have not been revoked. Are you aware of whether that applies in Nelson? Because that adds another layer of complexity and dimension to Auckland.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the legal background to the Nelson situation.
Thank you, Chair.
That's it. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Newman. Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Richard, thank you very much for your presentation, which I think is helpful to us. In order to maximise the potential of the marinas for both the public and for the direct users, there are obviously considerable costs, including the leases given out to private leaseholders, which lock them in for 70, 80 years in some cases. In your view, where should the costs lie in developing the full potential of the marinas? Because that's a consideration we have to take into account. It could be very, very expensive.
Mayor, I think that's an issue really to be addressed by the strategic plan, but I would observe that if a leaseholder has 70, 80 years duration, there is every incentive for a business to make a business investment. It will obviously be guided by the planning controls associated with the land that they have in front of them. But I don't see that the developments that we're talking about in terms of marina operations and marina functions would require significant investments. that were not, that were council investments. I can't think of why there would be a need for a council investment to actually do that. That is, again, I just repeat the outcome from the Nelson strategy. When they looked at those issues, they determined that the better economic outcome for Nelson was achieved through council retaining its ownership. They looked at PPP arrangements to enter into. They looked at all of their lease arrangements, and they were able to develop what looks like a thoroughly well thought through strategy that doesn't have significant financial implications for Nelson City.
I guess if I can, through you, Mr. Chair, obviously, public space, that may be council obligation to develop that to its potential, but to the extent to which there is a private use of the marinas and the extent to which, some of these marinas do need quite a lot of development. You mentioned, climate change and various other things that will impact on all of us. To what extent do you think the users are prepared to bear a fair share of the costs of that development?
If I can address the marina facilities themselves, the lease arrangements for berth holders, they have obviously an end date, and that varies around the Auckland region. The provision of those lease agreements are that if there are major refurbishment costs to be incurred, redevelopment of the marina infrastructure, that will fall upon the berth owners and the lessees. We pay for all of the maintenance of car parks and the informal open space as it stands at the moment. That's part of the operating expenses that we pay every year. So if it's marina dedicated use, berth holders have either paid for that through their leases and would do in the future, or through annual operating expenses. So hence my answer to your earlier question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Councillor Lee, please.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Steele, for the impressive presentation. You mentioned consultation and implied that there were shortcomings there. Could you elaborate on that, please?
The concern our members have for that is that it's quite clear from the information that we have available that Panuku has been progressing a strategy to sell land, certainly at Gulf Harbour and Hobsonville, over a period of time. That only became apparent last year when people started to pick up on information. It's taken a considerable amount of effort to find out what is really going on and the reasons behind it. It was apparent only after challenging Panuku through the public information sessions at Gulf Harbour that we were able to determine that Panuku had a strategy to sell land. We were able to obtain information on that. Stakeholder feedback in the Panuku minutes recognises the issues that were raised and records those, but it has never actually reported on how they've been addressed. So how does, all of the issues that we have raised, which I've tried to outline today, have not been addressed to date. So that is the major flaw. Marina users have really pushed themselves forward to get heard rather than being embraced by the organisations pursuing this strategy.
And just a follow-up, and as the result of the actual consultation, was there any reflection or that your concerns had been understood or taken on board?
I think it's fair to say that the concept of embracing the recommendation we made for a marina strategy for Auckland and the covering report which indicates that Council is now moving to consider that's a reflection of the concerns that we had raised. Our concern is that the covering report and the scope and the approach to delivery of that marina strategy is not fit for purpose. It doesn't reflect the concerns that we raised or the need for a wider marina strategy.
I think the idea for the strategy came from within the council rather than Panuku, but...
Well, I don't know whether it came from within council, but I certainly highlighted it
in response to your
in a
idea.
press article.
Thank
yes.
you.
Yep. No, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Cashmore.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Richard, you never mentioned at all about the public transport role that often some of these marinas play. How important do you see that as in the context of the Marina Users Association and the Auckland Purvey?
We see, obviously the support and continuation of ferry operations is important to the marinas. They're a safe harbour. I think the question is how is it approached at each of the marinas? There has been, I'll just touch on this briefly, one of the reasons that put forward for residential development on marina land has been to support transport demand. One of the strategic studies I've been involved in the past was the first passenger transport network plan for Auckland. The demand generated from those developments will not make or break ferry operations around Auckland. There are thousands of people in vicinity of marinas and ferry operations who use those because they are a no-brainer. They get past the motorway. So you don't need to build apartments on marina land to attract ferry users. And there's already good provision for marina operations ferry operations in marinas, and we'd support that being continued. Another thing that certainly our association has considered is that there's a lot of car parking space at marinas, which often during the week is not utilised fully. If somebody can come up with, as part of this strategy, a smart operation for car parking so that the use by berth holders is protected at weekends with the times that they need to use it, and it's flexible in its use for ferry users, park and ride, what a great outcome. An issue that can easily be addressed by the strategy. So I think there are opportunities to continue to support and help development of the ferry operations without impacting on the marina amenity itself.
I think, Mr. Chair, that brings a very valid point, is the fact that we are really challenged in some marinas for car parking spaces, and let alone bus turnaround areas. Of the 4 marinas I know very well, they are completely full up in the car spacing time, and there's no room for buses at all virtually. So that's a real challenge we have to work through in this.
Yeah. I'd make a comment also. We recently went through
Sorry,
a hearing
Richard,
process.
I'm going to have to edit you down. Sorry, we've taken up a lot of time, and I really appreciate what you've offered us. Members, can I just interrupt here? I did, as chair, commit to Auckland Transport that we'd hear from them at 11. There is a constraint with the chair and the chief executive. They have got another commitment in the very early afternoon, which is not too far away. I've got 3 more questions here. Can I take them very briefly, and if we can have a tight, concise response, but I would like to move to the road safety item straight after this, and apologies to Ben Ross. Can you accommodate us, Ben? Thank you. Can I quickly take these questions, if you still wish to pose them? Councillor Simpson, Member Namani, Councillor Cooper. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Steele.
Sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Steele, thank you very much for your presentation. I had some concerns with the recommendations, so I'm just keen to understand exactly, to be very clear exactly what you would like us to do next, because I don't think just doing nothing is going to work. So if I'm not mistaken, what you're saying is that you believe that we should have a regional strategy for Auckland with regards to marinas right across the region, and that's including not just ours, but the private ones and everything, include that in. Then you actually want to ensure that there's a discussion or a steering group together to formulate that for the future. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Including your group. And is there anything else that I've missed? Because I think that something needs to be done. The third point that I picked up, were you actually saying that you didn't want any sales to go ahead until that strategy had been completed?
That's correct.
So those are the three things. So then finally, do you have any, and this may be I shouldn't be saying above your head, but what sort of time frame do you think we could pull that off? Because I mean, in some respects, I see where Panuku's coming from as well, and we don't want this to last for 3 years, you know? No. How quickly, realistically, do you think, if that stakeholder group got together and worked with staff and put something together, how quickly or realistic do you think that could be formulated?
Again, it comes back to my point that you need to complete the scoping stage first to fully define it. But I would have thought that 6 to 12 months was a realistic time frame.
So if we sort of tried to work within that period, worst case, preferably best case 6 months, Mr. Chair, you know, I might have to look at something. Has anyone drafted any alternate resolutions? I will, if nobody.
Can I just note that this is public input. We have an item coming up, and you can address it there. Member Namani?
Kia ora, just a very simple question. How many Māori hold births in the marinas that you're aware of? Is that even a thing that you're aware of?
It's not a statistic that we have available to us as an association, but we are.
Gut instinct?
Sorry.
Your gut instinct?
Take a guess.
10%, but I would just make the comment that one of the things, again, you know, when you start thinking about a strategy for Auckland's marinas, the way in which we could embrace activities such as Wakarama beyond their current Okahu Bay location around Auckland and really, you know, take that on board is a great opportunity.
So you've been a strong advocate for Māori in the past?
Yes, yes. I've been involved in, as I say, a number of strategic studies that have involved Maori input.
I'll move the receipt of the input from Richard Steele today. Thank you. And on behalf of the AMUA.
Second.
AMUA, yes. Do I have a second from Councillor Wayne Walker? Thank you. Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you.
David, we didn't have any questions on Bayswater. I think it was much more of a general discussion anyway, rather than a specific marina discussion. Appreciate you coming too, though, David. Chairman. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you. We'll go straight now to the road safety item, members, on our main agenda at item 9. Welcome to the